Hey everybody, my name's Steve Knight. I'm the Program Director of the Preservation Program here at National Library. This is the National Digital Heritage Archive. One of the things about the National Library is that we've been collecting stuff for a long time, and we've been collecting a lot of old stuff for a long time. So we have bits in the collections that Sumerian cuneiform going back 4,000 years. We've got one of the best Milton collections in the world, and we've got over 20,000 old rare books sort of dating back to 1469. And in some sense we kind of we think we know what we're doing with those things, and we think we've got the programs right about how to look after that stuff. For the last 10 years or so, we've also been collecting digital stuff. So we've been creating digital collections that have to last 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, in the same way that our physical collections do. And what we can't say is that we really know what we're doing in that space. And we've got almost 2 million digital objects in our collections, and we probably can't yet put our hands on our hearts and say that we actually are able to preserve those things into the future, or to hold and carry those things into the future. So that's kind of the challenge of the digital preservation program within the library. Which brings us here today. The library is part of a grouping called National and State Libraries of Australasia. It's the 2 national libraries and the 8 state and territory libraries of Australia. And within that there's a digital preservation working group. And it's this Digital Preservation Week is occurring simultaneously in New Zealand and Australia across those 10 organisations in those 10 jurisdictions. And one of the things that we're trying to do is think about how the impact of digital does affect us in our daily lives, and also what the implications are for collecting institutions like the National Library of New Zealand. That's it from me, and I want to hand you over to Adrian Kingston. Adrian is the Digital Operations Lead at Te Papa, and he'll be facilitating the session today. Enjoy.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. So, as Steve mentioned, there's essentially 3 parts to this. We're talking about digital lifestyles, and you can kind of think of it as broadly or as narrowly as you like. We'll kind of focus in on some of it as we go. But basically, we're going to play the vodcast by a commentator in Australia, and then we're going to move to Chris's kind of response, but also obviously a lot of his own thoughts. The vodcaster is Dr. Rebecca Huntley. She's a social researcher and commentator, columnist, and for the Business Weekly Review, and author of many books, including Nonna's Gnocchi, Does Cooking Matter?, and Eating Between the Lines, Food Inequality in Australia. She's currently the senior editor and director of Insights and Research at Mamma Mia Women's Network. That vodcast will be followed by Chris, I should say Dr Chris McDowall, I always forget the doctor bit. And he is a geographer and data specialist, and currently product manager at a technology charity, Figure.nz. And he does a lot more than that as well, but you'll start to see some of that as we go on. So we'll start with the vodcast, and then we'll move on to Chris, and then we'll have some discussion.
My name's Rebecca Huntley. I'm a social researcher and writer. I spent the last 10 years listening to Australians talk about their lives. Everything: work, love, relationships, education, politics, you name it. So a couple of years ago I started researching my family history, and particularly the life of my grandmother and great-grandmother who came from Italy before the First World War. And these were women who weren't particularly literate. So there weren't lots of letters or diaries, but there were photos and there were a few documents. Luckily, the National Library digitised a lot of the immigration documents. So there's some documents there that allowed me to piece together a little bit about their life. Reflecting now on my life and the documents in my life, a lot is just not written down. There are some letters from when I was a kid, but pretty much all photos and all correspondence is digital. So if my great-granddaughter wants to understand the kind of life I lived, if I don't leave some kind of footprint, if I don't protect those most important documents, she may not have either hard copy documents in a kind of box gathering dust somewhere, but she might also not have the digital documents. So it just shows you that we've in a very quick time moved from, the physical world of physical photos, all kinds of official documents being in hard copy, letters and diaries, to a kind of digital life. And we need to be able to preserve that in order for us to, really fully take benefit of understanding how people live their lives today. One of the things you notice when you talk to Australians about their digital life is how many photos are in people's devices. I mean, they're lucky even to download them onto a desktop, and they're certainly not very good and vigilant about backing them up. And every now and then people say, oh my God, if I lost my phone, I'd lose the first 3 years of my daughter's life. The other thing, of course, you notice too is interesting correspondence, and it might be between, and this might be on email, but it also might be in some other form. In the old days when you wrote a correspondence between you and your mother, might have lived somewhere else, you would have found a way to preserve it. And we've just kind of lost those old traditions of preserving those kinds of things. So we forget that we're creating important, meaningful content in our working lives and our private lives and our lives as citizens or community members all the time. So I do think we do need to start thinking about not only preserving the photos that we take of our children and the correspondence between us and the people that we love to pass down to future generations. We also need to think about any document that might be correspondence between us and somebody we admire, a politician or a writer or a sports person. I mean, even just an email exchange, however kind of simple, could be a really important part of our national story and one worth preserving.
I'm going to tease out just a few of the threads that Rebecca's video prompted me to think about, and I'm not going to go too deeply into any of them, and they're more just sort of a seed, I think, for the discussion later. I'm going to try and limit this to 10 to 15 minutes. Can you just please tell me if I'll probably ramble, so just stop that. But before I start, I do want to just share a little anecdote, which watching that and an earlier conversation, it occurs to me that it's salient. So, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks ago, Lynn and Adrian and I had this quite amazing phone conversation about this event and some of the things that we'd talk about. And I wrote all of these notes down I have a big desk pad by my computer, and I wrote all these notes down. And it's been a very, very busy time. And so I only put this presentation together yesterday afternoon. And so I left the house and I took a photograph of the desk pad, and I got on the ferry and went to look at the photograph, and my camera had crashed and I'd lost the photograph. And so it's preserved at home on my desk, but I haven't been there since yesterday morning. So this is a little bit of a different presentation to what we talked about. So digital is really fragile. So these are sort of just different, 3 or 4 different threads that I pulled out from Rebecca's video. The first, I think, is just something, it's sort of a different angle on something that Rebecca alludes to in the video, where she's talking about researching your family history and the potential transience of digital media. And it sort of made me think a bit about newspapers, in fact, and some things that I'd seen recently. And I think newspapers actually, within industries, media industries, I think they've actually got a really, really good track record of preservation of paper newspapers. I think within New Zealand, the Papers Past project is an exemplary international model for that. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I've watched the rise of data journalism with considerable interest and enthusiasm. And I think that the efforts that they've made, the data journalists, in order to convey sort of salient aspects of data sets and present them in a visual form, it's been a really, really valuable endeavour. But they haven't really been built with the future in mind. So this, I think, came from the Washington Post. I might be wrong there. I need to just check where I got it from. But it was 2013. It looked like this. And then a few weeks ago, it looked like that. The technology that enables these interactives to be created just relentlessly moves on. And it's, even though this little bit of code might work, the stuff that's around it can change, and these bits of software are so complex that can lead to things breaking. Robert Coursera was actually the one who highlighted this. He did this amazing survey on the blog Eager Eyes, where he just went through a series of visualizations that have been produced across the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other outlets over the last 5 years, and highlighted all the ones that had broken. And it's actually, I think, a decision that needs to be made is, are these transient phenomena that just live in the moment, or are they worth preserving? And if these things are worth preserving, how do we do that? The second thing that I wanted to talk about was actually something that came to mind after last week's up in Auckland, there was a festival called Loading Docks. And Loading Docks was amazing. It was a series of 10 locally made documentaries, and each one was around 3 or 4 minutes long. So very, very short. You could sort of sit down and watch them all in around about an hour. Or under an hour. And one of the conversations, one of the films was actually, I think, quite close to the National Library's heart. It was around white aviation, and it was about, it was called The Colorist, and it was where a woman, Grace Rawson, who is 83, I think, at the time that this was filmed, she's reminiscing about the forgotten art of hand-tinted photography, and she demonstrates it for the camera in this documentary and sort of talks about it. So I'm just going to read the film summary. The hand-tinted photographic landscape of White's aviation have become celebrated icons of New Zealand's mid-century culture. But few still know that each photograph was individually coloured by hand. 83-year-old Grace Rawson provides a new perspective on the work when she picks up the cotton wool one more time to showcase the wonderful aesthetic of a lost art. Social expectations of photography and its process have radically changed, but nothing can change the authenticity and the aesthetic of a handmade craft. And so watching through that short film, it got me thinking about a quote that I'd encountered the week before on a subreddit called Shower Thoughts. And the quote is just this: "Instead of colorizing photos, in 50 years we'll be removing filters." And we live in this time when people are creating these very, very strange, quite playful artifacts. Grace Rawson and her contemporaries were adding detail to images, sometimes restoring images, sometimes actually adding colour to images, in order to get a sort of a higher fidelity representation and in their own words, a more realistic image. Many of the things that we currently are photographing and then passing through either programs like Instagram or Snapchat, those filters perhaps offer a different challenge to future folk who want to approximate the real, as we add all these strange visual elements to these images in this kind of like almost playful kind of dress-up game that happens online. This is a glimpse into my own life. Over the Christmas period, I stayed at Mum's place for a few days, and over Christmas dinner, we all got talking just about family history as the sort of thing that many families do each year. And we continued that conversation on Boxing Day, and she actually went out to the garage and retrieved a literal shoebox of documents. So the box contained all different sorts of materials that are precious to my family. So this is a selection of them. So there's things like my great-grandfather's dispersal certificate when he returned to Auckland in the months following World War I. There's my grandfather's tram driver certificate, which was this really important milestone in his working life. He was an Auckland tram operator and later a bus driver. And so I photographed the contents of all of these things, and I used the phone actually that's sitting on that table next to Adrian, and they were automatically synced up to my Google Photos cloud account. I then actually created an account on Ancestry.com, and I've been slowly sort of compiling a family tree. And I did these things because I was interested, but I also did them because they were really easy. So the Google Photos sync just took place without me even thinking about it. Like I took the photographs and it just synced because that's how my phone's sort of set up. The phone just does it. I don't even remember really turning it on, but I guess I did at some point. The Ancestry.com was free for the first couple of months. And its design sort of gave it almost like a kind of a game-like feel. I actually remember talking to Ruben about this at the time, where I was sort of hunting around for clues and slowly unlocking this ever-expanding tree of connections. And yet it all makes me feel a little bit uneasy. And here we go. So this was an amazing article that Scott Bio wrote last year. It's a really incredible piece. So the piece is literally called "Never Trust a Corporation to Do a Library's Job." And, sorry, not Scott Bio, Andy Bio. And Scott Bio is someone quite different. Sorry, that's Charles in charge, and yeah, in my mind, the Republican convention for the first time in decades. So Andy Bio wrote this piece about Google's shifting priorities. So, and it's really about how sort of after a decade of various efforts within the company that sought to help people touch history, Google has refocused in 2015 very much on the present and the future. There still is some of this historical looking work, but it's become much more diminished. So this is literally from Andy's article. In 2001, Google made their first acquisition. It was a collection of Usenet archives. It eventually became Google Groups, but you could still go back through time. The Google Books initiative in 2004, where the aspiration was to scan every known book and make these things searchable and available. The Google News Archive, similar, but with historical news. And then in the last 5 years, starting in 2010, the shifting priorities of Google's management left these archival projects in limbo or abandoned entirely. In 2015, Google is focused on the present and the future, its social and mobile efforts, experiments with robotics and artificial intelligence, blah, 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 blah. This, I think, is the most interesting line. As it turns out, organizing the world's information isn't always profitable. Projects that preserve the past for the public good aren't really a big profit center. Old Google knew that, but it didn't seem to care. I'm just going to leave that there, and that's something that we can come back to. I should say that the same article actually responds to the initial bleak section around Google in particular, with talking about the Internet Archive and the amazing efforts of that particular charitable organization. And I think the Internet Archive is an institution that, from everything I know about it, seems to have its heart in the right place and is doing incredible work. But I still think that there really is a place for, there are things that I trust a memory institution like this one, or like Archives New Zealand or Te Papa to do, that I don't trust a corporation. And yet I still put my stuff there because it's really easy. Yeah. So the final thing, I guess, is just talking about two futures of many. The first is a future which I think is what perhaps Rebecca was maybe hinting at, where these materials are really fragile and things break, and the things that we thought we had one day, we wake up, or probably not wake up and realize they're gone, but in a year or two we go back to look and it's like, oh, that stuff is no longer there. And I actually think that is what will happen with a great deal of digital materials. But another future that I see is almost the flip of that, and I think that these two things are not mutually exclusive. This is just a still from the British television show Black Mirror. Has anybody? Yeah, it's quite. I was going to play a clip, but it's very hard to find a clip which doesn't have a lot of swearing in it, so I thought it was inappropriate. But this is a really interesting, I think the most interesting episode of all, the entire history of you, and Adrian was one who reminded me that we should take a little look at it. And the premise of the entire history of you is that each person has a device in their eyes where they can record every moment that they lived, and they can play it back either for themselves or for other people. And they explore what that would look like over a kind of kitchen sink drama for an hour. And it's amazing. It's an amazing piece of film. And this is a dinner party that happens near the beginning, where a couple have returned from a holiday in Europe, and they're watching back the video of the hotel room where the guy has taken the photograph of the fraying carpet, and he's just so disgusted that this room has this piece of this carpet that isn't up to his standards, and he's never going to be able to forget it. And he just keeps insisting on showing it to all, and it's just this amazing moment of something, instead of going for the kind of more dramatic aspects of what the technological implications of this might be, the societal implications. It's instead this incredibly mundane exchange, but it's something that's so recognizable. The other thing this is a short story, which I would again recommend that you read. I would also put some sort of minor warnings around this, just around its content. It's called Life After a Total Hack, and it's a short story that happens over several thousand words, exploring what happens the day or in the weeks following a hack that makes every person's online history in Facebook and Google Mail, Gmail, and Twitter and so on, private messages, free to search for anybody. And it's kind of something that unpicks what happens when the private becomes public. And so I see all of these things in a big mix together, and I just don't know I don't know what's going to happen with digital lifestyles and preservation, but I think we're in for some interesting times. There you go, Adrian.
Very good. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff, so we kind of have to stand here for the camera.
Right.
So this is kind of the discussion part. I've got a few things that I'm kind of have pulled out from the discussions that we've had and also from what's just come up in the last few minutes, but we will of course be throwing back to you guys as well. But there was one thing I wanted to pick up, and it's partly because it's the easy one. It's the easy one to attack. Never trust a corporation to do a library's job. What if the library isn't doing the library's job? There is a huge amount of information that we're generating, and I think that's one of the problems that we have is the sheer volume. We couldn't really imagine how much there is out there. How do we actually identify finding those shoeboxes, the ones that are important, and then the bits that are important within those? And I don't think that we can actually deal with digital lifestyles or the future of looking back at digital culture by looking at individual files or those sorts of things. And we're now at the point, and I think it's started to come out, where there's so many dependencies that we actually need to start looking at themes or concatenations. And this is again is where Google is looking at AI, and I think AI is a big part of the future of storytelling and of preservation, because we're going to need AI to actually understand the sheer volume of stuff that we have and tell some interesting stories out of it. And Google's investing in it, but libraries and sectors of course aren't, because we're not resourced to do that kind of thing. And Google's already doing it for the stuff in our daily lives. So Google's already making me stories using AIs. Whenever I upload a bunch of photographs, it will merge them for me and create a better one. And I think that's amazing, but obviously a lot of people are worried about that. But it is that thing of, I used to worry about file formats as someone who was interested in preservation. I'm now worried about platforms instead, because that's what we kind of need to do. Platforms and networks, that's where we should be looking rather than individual formats.
Yeah, I'm gonna respond to your challenge with another challenge. But one of the incredible things about libraries and museums is the curatorial aspect of what folk in these memory institutions do, and so much of what I see online is kind of almost like free floating stuff that kind of exist, and there might be links between things, but there are these resources that sort of exist in isolation or seeming isolation, and what they lack is being part of a wider context or collection, so that when someone returns to them after the fact, that they actually make sense. So when I go to my parents' house, there are these photo albums, and there are these photo albums that are arranged in the chronological order that have been put together, and I can go through it, and there is something there. Whereas when I encounter stuff online, like if I go to a Imgur, I don't even know how do you pronounce Imgur?
Imgur, that's what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So like one of these big image photo bucket things that have are storing billions and billions of images. These things completely lack any context. Although, as you said, Google have done. I had a couple of slides which are actually. I didn't want to make this talk too long, which were within that same Google Photos account, which I showed you before with my family. there was another thing just like this almost, which was I went to Waitomo caves last year in October, and I got back from Waitomo and Google just let me know that I had a new album, and I went into my album and Google had actually like drawn a map which showed my trip from Auckland down to Waitomo. They'd put in this pictures of me arriving, pictures of us like going caving, pictures of the dinner that we had, and because it had somehow gone across my location and temporal history and seen that this was an unusual event where I was taking more photographs, and I was like, oh my goodness. So, what?
No, I think that's exactly, to me, that's where there's so much more, because that is what I think as end users of, so instead of having created a photo album and picked out your own things, Google's kind of doing it for us, but that is one of the ways that enables us to deal with this year. You know, back when you had to use film, you had to be really careful with the images you took, and then you had to be even more careful with the ones that you printed. Now you don't. We just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot, and most of us don't delete. Particularly from my phones, unless we do like, I don't even remember what that was, and just delete the whole lot. But now Google is attempting to find ways to group those so that we can at least identify the groups, and that might be the stuff that is retained over time. And so there's almost a degree of pre-curation that's happening. And the idea of the context is kind of interesting as well, because at Te Papa's archives we have lots of one-sided conversations where we've got letters from one person, or and it's like, okay, that's great, but we never saw the response. But at least with email threads and things, we're starting to get that. So maybe there's some of this context, and with the networking, with the companies making the networking easier, particularly if you're within a particular ecosystem, I kind of think, is our library still, curatorial work is amazing, but are we doing the right kind of curatorial work?
And I'd almost like to open this up, because I think there are so many people in the room who would have had incredible perspectives on this. I guess I just want to reiterate what I was saying here. It was some real talk with you all, because I was trying to just let you know that even though I know that I'm kind of doing the wrong thing, it's just so much easier. It's so easy. Like, I just don't have to do it. I just accept the terms and conditions. I don't even need to read those. And Google organizes it for me. That's kind of terrible, because I actually don't know what I've signed up for, and I don't know. I have no idea what I've by clicking yes, I'm allowing both Ancestry.com and the Google Corporation to do with my stuff. It's just very, very convenient. Yeah.
Does anyone? Should we throw?
That
it
wasn't
out
meant to
at
be
this
quite
stage?
simply.
And GeoCities was a really simple example compared to what we're talking about now.
There's something I would just like to respond to, or I guess riff off, that Jade said, which I actually cut from the talk, but because I didn't feel like I could quite do it justice, but in some ways it was the most important thing that I wanted to say, which is really like, I look back at the Alexander Turnbull collections from 100 years ago, and I look back at things like, I don't know, like the outputs of Colenso, or the Adkins diaries, or things like this, and I just wonder what they would think of what we do with that stuff now. Like, the world was unrecognizable 100 years ago, and to contribute these materials to a collecting institution then, and I know very little about the terms of those collections, but the fact that it's no longer the fact that a researcher can go to a building and sign in and sit down with the white gloves and the box and go through the stuff. I could go through it last night, and I did. Like, I looked at the Colenso papers last night at home on the internet in my pajamas, like at 11 o'clock at night, and that's what you do, Jay. And I project forward 100 years and think about the materials that we're producing today. And I think about the digital shoebox that these are just kind of all getting stuffed into. And just, I look at some of the work that people like, say, Tim Sherratt are doing in Australia around face recognition and identity matching. And then I project that forward 100 years and it's like, oh my goodness, I can't possibly imagine what that is. And there's something in there and I haven't got my head around it. But that's what you were just saying draws to mind.
I think that's a really interesting point in terms of, as a society, how do we want to look back at ourselves in 100 years? And there are a number of areas where we are doing stuff entirely different to how we did before. There is a lot more third-party involvement. There's a lot more happening outside of New Zealand. So if you think of TV and music, is there going to be sort of another Dunedin era? How are we going to look at the remake of Goodbye Pork Pie compared to the original, the impact it had on a particular industry now that it's going to be mainly distributed through Netflix or whatever? So a lot of that comes down to, okay, so with all of this distribution and with cultural institutions doing as much as they can, but really always playing catch up because we don't have the thing to do of, what is Google going to do next? Well, we haven't got a clue. And so therefore, how are we going to sort of work our way through? We're always having to reverse engineer. So it's not necessarily about the technology or the preservation. It is about trust, and it's about understanding how our culture and society want to work with all of these new ways of working, and whose role is it to actually figure out that trust thing. I was starting to think that it was the individuals because from what you're saying, the corporations are there to do a particular thing, and that is make great products so that they get customers, so they get paid. I think more and more companies are working to make sure that they make great products because that's how it's tougher, but in the end they want to make money. The library can't do it. Individuals are just signing things away. As a reasonably digitally, technologically savvy person, I kind of know what's happening when I click yes. Because I know what I'm getting in return, and that's what I'm interested in. And a lot of people don't. So is it the government's role? Is it some other sector that's involved in looking at how do we look at this in the long term if it's something that the heritage sector itself can't do? That's just something that came to mind when we were just talking about it, so I don't know. But it is that thing of we've got these kind of things and we're looking at a particular area, but maybe we should actually be looking at, we work quite differently to how we did now, so we need to rethink how we think about all of these things, how we collect, etc.
I was actually wondering that first question this morning, and I tried to find the answer, and I couldn't find an answer at scale, but there might be, I'm sure, there were certainly philanthropical organisations, but I wonder if there might be somebody else in the room who could respond to that.
One thing that immediately springs to mind is newspapers to a degree, because they did have mass circulation. There was probably more personal information that goes into them now than they do now. Who's just arrived in town, who's getting married, kind of odd things like that, little bits of gossip. Lots of who's gone to jail, who was drunk at a particular thing, little snippets. Communities were smaller. It's definitely not at the same scale, but there's a little bit of that. I think probably what's more likely is that it was actually governmental departments that were doing the mass collecting of data. So it's not the same risk, but censuses have obviously been going on for a while. There's a whole lot of work around what's the information that Stats has right now, and I forget what it's called, but the joint systems that they've got going on with lots of government departments. And they say, no, honestly, it's really secure and we know exactly what we're doing.
IDI.
Yeah, and then as soon as the formal presentations stop, they go, well, we know that there's probably a few gaps. So I definitely can't. But does anybody else think of anything at scale in the analog world that is comparable to Google, a corporate collecting masses of information?
there are a couple of hands up who look like they can address this. I'd also like to address the second point.
Regarding collecting information at scale, Metternich organised a European postal service so that he could copy everything, but I think he successfully kept it secret, so it wasn't a matter of public concern. Regarding archives in 100 years' time, I like science fiction which says that not being electronically implanted will be deviant, so there'll be an ambient unconscious of random data that seems to be related to your current thoughts.
Yeah.
And what, if anything, would you like done to the government surveillance culture so that people were more willing to trust attempts to preserve their personal history?
Can we come back to that? Because and I can see that Steve in particular, I think, is quite keen to address the second point from the earlier question. I'd like to return to surveillance.
I just wanted to respond to the second part of your question, which was around a global network. And one of the ways that we frame up our digital program is a local node in a global network. So I think there's a way to actually create a federated kind of process where various jurisdictions have responsibilities, and then we find the mechanisms to actually lift that up to a global level. So that's kind of how we're conceptualizing that idea at the moment.
To just add a little bit onto what Steve said, I was going to say something very similar, but I guess I just want to also note that, and I guess this is actually in a way responding to some of the things in that Google article, is that we do have these incredible national histories, and I think those histories are best told by the nations themselves, and I think it's really important to have that sort of a degree of self-determination in your as a memory institution, and I think that the connections between, we need more connections between national institutions, but it's really important for nations to be able to talk about themselves.
Do you want to talk about surveillance?
It's all right.
I can't think of a case of 100 years ago, but the nearest that struck me was 50 years ago. The Stasi in East Germany collected universally about everything. It's but that's the kind of thing that happened.
Talking about surveillance.
Right.
Yeah,
No,
exactly. But that makes, exactly, so they're kind of combined. Yeah, definitely.
And it was all for the public good.
Yeah.
Only not from a formal. I was working at MCH at the time, but not from that perspective. My understanding was that Fairfax was struggling with dealing with the mass of archives that they had. Their decision was to go offshore to a company that had a model where they would scan the photos, return the digital copies to Fairfax, retain the prints, and sell off the significant prints. So prints of, Hillary, I think, is one of the people who came up, and that was their model for making money.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
It
all kind of fell apart.
It was a commercial picture library, wasn't it?
It was a commercial picture library, yeah.
And that went against?
And that got stuck against the Protected Objects Act, yeah. And so there was a arrangement between Culture and Heritage and Fairfax, and that the prints would also be returned. And the most significant ones retained in New Zealand. Was that the original intention? I'm sorry, I'm looking at Matariki. She was there at the time too, but I can't remember. Yeah.
There was a very short period of MCH being able to go through the material and identify the significant material.
Yeah, and then of course the company went under and the whole thing kind of fell over, so I'm not sure.
And then of course Fairfax's Australian ownership and things to them saying, look, we're an international already, blah, blah, blah. So, and I guess that comes back to volume and capability and the crossover of legislation versus commercial and public and everything else. But a really good example of a company thinking, well, this is our stuff, we can just do whatever we want. And then, yeah.
Can I link that back to platform then? So, and this actually for me is one of the issues with platform stuff. Try being a corporate entity, I don't mean a corporation, I mean a corporate entity, and deal with Tumblr, for example, and say, hey, this Tumble Arena person, whatever they want to be known as, is a New Zealand person, and they are of interest to a collecting institution. We would like to use your mechanisms to collect their stuff. We want to do it computationally because it doesn't make any sense to sit and do. The API doesn't allow you to do that, and the corporation won't engage with you as an individual because there's absolutely no commercial interest in them. And in fact, the contrary is true because they have that commercial interest in their archive. Tumblr famously sold their archive, Twitter famously sold their archive. So if you want to, they gave a fire hose to the Library of Congress, said here you go, here's 2 billion tweets a day, deal with that, good luck. And in the meantime set up a very nice corporate mechanism, which if we wanted to get New Zealand's Twitter history out of Twitter, we could do so, but it would cost us some pretty decent amount of change. So for me, there's something missing from the ecosystem, is that piece of legislation that says this is nationally interesting, that the national entity is allowed to operate as a non-commercial entity with that platform, but that entity doesn't exist in that platform's world, and I think for me that's one of the keys.
I'll just quickly say that when I talked about platform, I guess I wasn't meaning the existing platform, but the context of the platform. Yeah, totally. Go, Chris.
Oh, I guess I've got a question for everybody here. And that is, to what degree does this matter? And I guess I'm only talking about some of it. So to what degree do we need to collect all this stuff? When I look back over, I would hate to be a teenager now. I'm so glad that I just snuck through before mobile phones. Like, nobody I knew had a mobile phone at high school. Like, there was enormous bricks. It was the early 90s. It was that I was at high school, left high school in 94, 95. I sort of escaped that side of things. And if I had have been, I don't know, 10, 15 years later, to sit in this room and hear someone like me get up here and talk about all of this, like collecting stuff for the future and worrying about whether it's going to be available and so on, I'd probably actually become a little bit concerned about all of the various things that I'd put up online and what the ephemera of the past is really different to the ephemera of today, and I'm not sure that it's really ephemera. That's the thing, is that I think that that's part of the point of the talk, is that the things that we treat as ephemera often aren't, and the things that we want to be permanent often dissolve and decay, and we're not actually that mindful about, as a whole society, about actually treating things in quite the right way and putting the structures in place. And so I guess that's what I'm wondering, is to what should we actually be collecting, and to what degree is it important to actually kind of... I've had conversations with people where they want to grab everything. They just want to grab everything just in case. And that is actually... It reminds me of the NSA or something, where it's like you just sweep the entire net and see what comes out. So I kind of just want to put that out and just see what people say. So many hands. That's awesome.
Luckily, I've got the microphone, so I'm going to jump in first. But it's interesting you're talking about Adkin before. And so one of the things that we have is George Leslie Adkin's diaries, and we have 40 years worth of them. And we also have the photographs that he took throughout his life, including when he was courting Maud. And in his diaries and recorded in his photographs is the entire courtship, including all the ups and downs. And he was a man who, I think he probably would have leapt on the technology. That was exactly what he would have been in Google all over the place if he could. So that's essentially, he recorded everything. He wasn't doing it because he was wanting it to be looked at in 100 years, but for us it's now really significant, and it does tell a story of New Zealand at the time. So it's that thing of, we can't decide now what is important. It does take a little bit of perspective. So if we're losing that opportunity to have perspective, again, it comes down to how fast is the library going to collect? Are we collecting en masse now because it's all we know how to do? We can't wait because we know it's going to disappear. Or are we don't have that opportunity for things to filter for a little bit and wait a couple of generations, because things are gone within years, let alone generations. But it's something in there about deciding what to collect and around what people would want. And just coming back to one thing that's been bugging me since the beginning. If we were collecting Snapchats, I wouldn't want to remove the filters because that's what we were actually doing. I think just coming back to the teenager thing. Someone else can have an opportunity to talk about.
And so Adrian comes with the microphone. Last night, late last night, I was on the Te Papa website, and one of the first photographs that came up in my search was a photograph of one of Adkins' daughters in a swimsuit in 1920 on a summer's day that the entire family has probably forgotten, but she's there in this bathing suit for all time.
Whether one of our iconic images that get used a lot.
Yeah.
I actually work on a team that's called Digital Collection Strategy, so we have been thinking quite seriously about this question lately. And one of the things we've really been talking about is, the traditional collect at the end of life cycle doesn't work, right? It's not gonna probably work for the digital stuff because it disappears, as we've been discussing. But at the same time, that curatorial eye, that being able to know what we want to collect versus just collecting everything is still a significant issue, because if it's just everything, it doesn't mean anything unless you build that context around it, and give people a sense of a way to get into it. So I don't have the solution, but I do think that we need to think that our traditional way of collecting is not going to be the only way that we have to think of new ways to collect. But at the same time, I don't want us to be the NSA and have everything. That doesn't work. And we also have certain legal responsibilities, for privacy of the people. We can't just collect things and then give out their information. And that's, I think, one of the differences between corporations and a library or a national archive is we're beholden to laws about privacy and access to people's records.
And on that note, it's actually my aunt and I, who have never really had much to do with each other, this has actually brought us together a bit. It's been a really nice effect that I wouldn't have anticipated, and it's been because of that mutually shared interest.
Can I add to the things we want to collect thing? So for me, one of the keys is it depends what you want to do with it, right? And so the curatorial position notwithstanding, if we collected all the text that was written in Snapchat, we can do linguistic analysis of the things that people of a certain demographic were doing in that space. Is that interesting? Who knows? But it might be. And so for me, it's all interesting. We can't collect it all, but we do kind of need to pick a strategy in terms of what we predictably think will be valuable. And one of those changes, I think, is how we can process data. You and I know that we can sit and churn a pile of 1 million units of information and come out with something insightful in not very many minutes, because we have computers that can do that for us. We couldn't do that 20 years ago. We certainly couldn't do it 100 years ago. So the tools we have as researchers, the tools we have as people who are interested in finding things out are completely different. So perhaps those collections do need to reflect that change in modality, the change in what we can do as researchers.
And yet also with great power comes great responsibility.
I
just want to reinforce what Jay just said, because the notion of curation came at a point in time. The reason we have the Atkins diaries and a whole bunch of other stuff that's 100 years old is an accident of survival to some extent. And if we are able to rethink our collecting and rethinking our contextual requirements, which is effectively what curation is, from a machine perspective, we might also be able to rethink the cultural, gender, other types of bias that's inherent in the collecting that we've actually done to date. And so we may actually be able to do a better job across the community within the constraints that we have around the various rights and obligations than we've actually been able to do in the past, and that may be something we should be thinking about as well.
I think that's it. I'd like to thank Chris, and obviously we would like to thank Rebecca, but she can't hear us. And yeah, thank you all very much for obviously a very wide-ranging but super interesting discussion.